It is indeed a great honor and privilege to come before you today, not only because of the prestige of your organization, the distinguished nature of your membership, and the very impressive roster of your past luncheon speakers, including my predecessor, Whitney Young, but also because I believe that the people in this room and the members of this club constitute a vital factor in stemming what appears to be the end of America's Second Reconstruction. The first Reconstruction ended in 1877, nearly a century ago, with the infamous Hayes-Tilden Compromise that resulted in the abandonment of the newly freed black population of the South by their former friends in the North. The decade from 1865 to 1876, like the period through which we have recently passed, was a time of bold social experiment and innovation. Slavery was ended, and black people, through the adoption of constitutional amendments and the passage of civil rights legislation, became equal in the eyes of the law and were granted the rights and privileges enjoyed by white citizens. Black people voted, held office, and made their way slowly toward the distant goal of social and economic equality. But that first Reconstruction was unfinished. The North wearied of the struggle, and the former rebels of the Confederacy were returned to power. The seeds of today's racial problems that divide the nation and rack its soul were planted in those dim, dark days. Now, in 1972, there is persuasive evidence that the Second Reconstruction, the dismantling of segregation and the further extension of basic civil rights to black people, is coming to an end. Once again, the North seems weary of the struggle. Once again, the righteous cause of black people seems relegated to national neglect. Once again, a period of national reconstruction and reform seems doomed to be unfinished and uncompleted. I believe that such an outcome would be tragic for black people who have continued to believe in America's bright promise through centuries of despair and oppression. And it would be tragic for this nation, dooming it to further polarization, unrest, and retrogression. We see all around us, in urban decay and in racial strife, how bitter is the harvest of our past. To further delay the resolution of these long-standing problems is to invite a deepening of the fissures that rend our nation and to invite a series of recurrent domestic crises that could topple the democratic foundations of our society. Several major national issues offer ground for speculation that the Second Reconstruction is nearing its end. The refusal to enact a sweeping reform of the welfare system is one. The failure to fully enforce the civil rights laws of the 60s is yet another. The ease with which the erstwhile friends of the civil rights movement have compromised on major legislation affecting black people is still another. The unwillingness of northern suburban communities to revise their zoning laws and to accept scattered site public housing and housing for low and moderate income families is another major indication that civil rights is a popular issue only when it is limited to the Deep South. But the single issue that has gripped the national imagination to the exclusion of all others, the one issue that stands as a major test of the willingness of America to continue on the path of equality, the one issue that has been subjected to near hysterical emotions and racial bitterness, is busing. The emergence of busing as a national political issue, proposals to end busing through legislative acts and congressional amendments, and above all, the administration's proposed moratorium on busing to achieve desegregation of racially segregated schools all offer a clear indication that the time of testing is upon us. In this single issue, there is bound tightly the strings of the civil rights revolution of the 60s. A federally imposed moratorium on busing amounts to a moratorium on human, legal, and constitutional rights. The path the country takes on the busing issue could well determine whether or not the Second Reconstruction comes to an inglorious end. It would be well to take a brief look at the busing issue, especially in light of the widespread myths and misconceptions that surround it. Busing is not an end in itself. It is but one of several mechanisms which can be used to desegregate illegal and unconstitutional racially segregated schools. 40% of all school children are bused, the vast majority for reasons that have nothing to do with desegregation. Only about 3% of children are bused for purposes of desegregation, and it has been estimated that even today, more children are bused to maintain segregation than to overcome it. The frequently heard myth that there is something called massive busing to achieve racial balance is false. Nationally, there is very little more busing now than there was 5 years ago. And in some southern states, court-ordered busing to desegregate the schools has actually resulted in less busing than previously. And children are not bused for racial balance. Busing, as ordered by the courts and other governmental bodies, takes place for one reason only: to desegregate segregated schools. Properly used, busing can be a valuable mechanism in overcoming the denial of equal educational opportunities. I speak from experience. As a student in the segregated David T. Howard High School in Atlanta in 1951, my 11th grade classmates and I studied geometry from beat-up, yellowing, marked textbooks used in 1935, the year of my birth, by white students in the all-white high school. Even with these hand-me-downs, my experience was still better than that of generations of black children whose segregated schools closed early to give them time to chop cotton in the fields, while white children rode by on school buses bound for the education that would enable them to escape poverty. I submit that the proposed anti-busing legislation would destroy the impetus to desegregate and create the conditions that would allow a return to those days and those practices. It would be far too easy to neglect the racial feelings that are at the root of the national hysteria over busing and that the proposed legislation encourages. It has become a mandatory cliche to deny that racial prejudices have anything to do with the busing controversy. But the truth, ugly as it is, must be laid on the table. I do not believe that the busing issue would gain the prominence it has if many white Americans did not cling to the notion that their kids must not go to school with black children. It was never an issue when black kids were bused past all white schools to attend all black schools. It has only become an issue as desegregation has drawn closer to reality. The Wall Street Journal of March 20th ran a remarkably frank article that reveals this fact. The journal talked with residents of Coy, Alabama, a town that used busing extensively to maintain segregated schools, but is now under orders to desegregate. The report quoted one man as saying that his grandchildren ain't going on a bus with a bunch of niggers to a school with nigger teachers. To the residents of Coy, busing isn't busing unless black children are bored. As long as we don't have niggers on there, it's not busing, said one woman. Busing is making the white children get on with the niggers. And a pillar of Coy's society, a state senator with a masterful gift for logic, declared, "We don't call what we've been doing busing. That's just carrying the children to school. If a kid's got to ride a bus 50 miles to get to school, I'm in favor of it. But I'm not in favor of carrying them 1 mile to achieve integration." Sickening as these feelings are, at least they are honest and frank. But one must respect honesty no matter how misguided. But when some white people in northern cities like Buffalo, New York, which recently defied the state's order to bus to desegregate, insist that race plays no part in their motives, then we are face to face with hypocrisy of the first order. At this point, I'm impelled to point out that the overwhelming majority of the black community sees the proposed legislation as a dangerous threat, not only to the constitutional process, but also to further progress in racial reconciliation. Many people have seized upon the anti-busing statements by a vociferous minority to prove that black people are against busing. The legitimate ghetto cry for community control is taken as an indication that black people do not want their children to go to white schools. The fact is that most black people are solidly for busing to desegregate the schools. Most black elected officials support it from the Congressional Black Caucus down to lower elected offices. Concern over the proposed legislation has even been publicly voiced by black appointed officials within the administration. The fact is that most black people are not fooled by the apparent increase in funds for ghetto schools. We know that the money in the Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1972 is simply transfer of funds from existing and pending legislation. I must point out that these funds are but a drop in the bucket compared to the need. Presented in their present form, they represent a thinly veiled bribe to accept resegregation accompanied by the pretense of increased compensatory education for the poor. At the root of the proposed moratorium is a feeling among many people that there has been enough integration, that the country must now pause and consolidate the gains that have been made, and that a moratorium on busing is a good way to do that. I will not deal here with the question of how much integration is enough, or of what percentage of his rights any citizen should be denied. I merely wish to point out that the moratorium is not a pause in the ongoing process of desegregation, but rather it is the rollback of what has already been achieved. Under the proposed legislation, any school district under court order to bus children to desegregate the schools can go back to the lower courts and ask for a revision of the order to comply with the new law. This and other features mean that many districts that have reluctantly desegregated can go back to separate schools. And the psychological effect of a moratorium on busing is to instill among many white citizens and among school boards the conviction that they never need desegregate. The debate over busing is reminiscent of the debate in the early 60s over the desegregation of public places. Then as now, the basic issue was one of access. There is no inherent virtue in sitting next to a white child in school, just as there was no inherent virtue in sitting next to a white person at a lunch counter. but there is considerable inherent virtue in equal access to the rights and privileges of this society. And that is what the civil rights struggle today, as in the 60s, is all about. So long as this society has pretensions of being democratic and open, and so long as the resources of public education are concentrated in the hands of the majority white population, the schools must be integrated. Finally, it is a truism that racial policies affect every corner of American life. The busing issue through the proposed moratorium has become a constitutional issue that may place this nation in a grave constitutional crisis. It represents a challenge to the finely wrought system of checks and balances that is the keystone of the American system of government, and constitutes a frontal attack on the separation of powers. The proposition that Congress has the right to put limits on the ways in which the courts can enforce the constitutional rights of citizens is a revival of the doctrine of interposition and is a gross usurpation of the prerogatives of the judicial branch of government by a co-equal branch, the legislative. Basically, the proposed legislation suggests that Congress can stop the courts from ordering busing to make school districts comply with the law and the Constitution. This, in spite of the multitude of court decisions establishing the role of the judiciary in defining constitutional rights and decisions on school segregation and busing. Further, appropriate legal mechanisms exist to remedy such rare cases of unreasonable busing as may exist. In the Charlotte-Mecklenburg decision, the court indicated that it would disallow capricious or unreasonable busing, and that it would not accept busing to achieve racial balance. There is then no need for congressional action, in itself dubious on constitutional grounds. I have dwelt on the busing issue because it is the latest manifestation of that timid spirit of withdrawal and defeatism in the struggle for human rights and dignity. It marks a key test of whether we as a nation have the moral fortitude to persist in our efforts to become a truly open, democratic, multiracial society. For nearly 2 decades, Black Americans and concerned white citizens, including the government and the judiciary, have labored to win compliance with the historic 1954 ruling that separate schools are unequal and unconstitutional. For nearly 2 decades, we have put up with violence, intimidation, open defiance of the law by school districts, covert defiance of the law, and a multitude of strategies designed to maintain segregated schools. Now, as we stand poised at the brink of the final dismantling of the dual school systems, the President of this nation has lent the weight of his office and the dignity of his position to the proposition that we can return to the days of separate but equal, and has proposed to allow the return of Jim Crow schools and the usurpation of the constitutional role of the judiciary. In proposing the moratorium, the President eloquently stated that there is a need to, quote, strike a balance which is thoughtful and just, to search for answers that will best serve all of our nation's children, unquote. Measured by that test, the proposed moratorium fails to answer the needs of our children, and it fails to provide the moral leadership our nation so sorely needs. We stand then at one of those turning points in history when a nation decides whether it will press forward to fulfill its noblest ideals, or whether it will give in to the basest impulses of the dark, hidden underside of the national spirit. I am seriously concerned that we are witnessing the beginning of the end of the Second Reconstruction. And I am moved to ask whether the moral fervor of the 60s will give way to moral cowardice in the 70s, and whether the faith and dreams of black people will be sabotaged once more. Thank you.
Mr. Jordan, if you would be kind enough to return to the rostrum, we have a number of questions for you. Is it not impossible to have separate education termed equal education?
Well, just based on my experience, and based on the experience of black people, with white school superintendents and white school boards, and white people making policy and controlling the money, and controlling the distribution of the facilities and the use of those facilities, I think the answer to that question is unequivocally no.
This one, I believe everything, and we have others along the same line, I believe everything you say is true. But can this be imposed if neither whites nor blacks want or support it? Or do they? What of the Gary Resolution?
First of all, in the 1960s, the Congress of the United States did not ask about majority will when it legislated against Selma, when it legislated against Montgomery, when it legislated against Shreveport. It didn't ask or inquire into the majority will of the vast majority of white Southerners who were against it. Now that the chickens have come home to roost, now that people are marching in Forest Hills and buses are burning in Pontiac, Michigan, those same congressmen who legislated against the South because they thought it was right and because they thought it was constitutional are now saying that we're caught in the middle, not understanding that black people are trapped at the bottom. I further think that the Gary Resolution on busing is one that I disagree with. But I think that inherent in that resolution is a weariness on the part of black people in that they're tired of carrying the burden of making this democracy be what it ought to be. They're tired of seeing people not do right before 1954. They're weary of seeing them do right wrong since 1954. And I think that there is a feeling, even amongst the most separatist black people in our community, have no faith in this new $2.5 billion for community control or with community control in the government. I think further that Gary represents, or that resolution represents, that that the black community is not a monolithic community, that it is a community that is diverse. It's a community where many people have had various kinds of experiences with racism, overt and covert, and to a large extent, that expression is a result of that experience with racism, but more importantly, it is a result of black people being worn and weary of dying and suffering to make the Constitution in this nation a reality.
Mr. Jordan, one member asks, would it not be better for the busing funds, would it not be better to use the busing funds to improve neighborhood schools and preserve the right to attend neighborhood schools?
Well, I have difficulty understanding really what a neighborhood school is. And the concept of the neighborhood school was never enforced where I went to school in the South and where most black people grew up. And it's only since the issue has become black children and black teachers and black administrators that we have moved to the concept of the neighborhood schools. The other response to that is that I don't see why we cannot do both, improve the neighborhood schools and also act consistently with the mandates of the courts and with the Constitution. I think the other problem, as you look at the $2.5 billion, it means that that money will be controlled not by black people, but by the school superintendent in Richmond County, Georgia, who says that black people have one size brain and white people have another size brain, and therefore black people cannot learn equally with white people. That is the fellow that's controlling the money that's to improve the community schools.
This question: what is being done and planned to stimulate more serious academic study at all levels by minorities? Another question limited the like question to college education.
I don't quite understand why it is that there has to be more stimulation of serious academic study by minorities as opposed to serious academic study by anybody in this country in any academic institution. I think that inherent in that is some notion that that I cannot brief my cases as well as the judge here, and I think that that's not true. I think that we can do something about the academic levels of all of these schools if we make the facilities of these schools and the admission policy of these schools open on an equal and equitable basis.
And this questioner asks, given complete freedom of choice, what percent of urban black parents would favor busing for the purpose of achieving racial integration?
Well, I think that begs a question. The decisions of the courts from Brown through Cooper versus Aaron through the Swan case do not talk about busing to achieve racial integration. The courts have ruled precisely that the dual school systems, that segregated schools, are unconstitutional and unequal. Nobody is suggesting that the purpose of the busing is to achieve racial balance. The purpose of the whole effort here is to do away with the system of separate and unequal schools and provide an opportunity for all persons in the society to attend those schools and receive an opportunity for equal educational facilities and services.
This question on an entirely different subject. What are the major differences, and I take it this means in viewpoint and approach, between the National Urban League and the National Association for Advancement of Colored People?
Well, I think if you're talking about policy differences, I think that we would not be terribly far apart. NAACP was founded in 1908. The Urban League was founded in 1910. The NAACP approach to the problem of the inequities in our society has been historically and basically legal. The Urban League's approach has been that of a service agency, staffed for the most part by social workers who perform at the local level basic services, training, education, minority counseling for employment and what have you. So we've been basically a service organization. Where we are most similar is that we're advocates for the needs and aspirations of black people. And in that advocacy, there are times when Whitney and Roy disagreed. There will be times when I will disagree with Mr. Wilkins. I think disagreement and diversity is healthy. And here again, it reinforces the fact that the black community is not a monolithic community having one notion and one way to achieve a desired goal.
Thank you, sir. This questioner asks, is not housing an underlying factor at the root of busing, employment opportunity, and the preservation and the perpetuation of the urban ghetto?
Which points up, in my view, the inconsistency with the proposed legislation. and that the legislation does not address itself to really doing something about making the suburban areas of our community and other areas of our community where blacks cannot buy, cannot rent, where people refuse to build even scatter site 2 or 3 little houses so that black people can, poor people can be where the jobs are. 80% of the new jobs in this country are not in the center city, but they're on the periphery of the town. And until such time that someone can deal seriously with the issue of whether or not blacks can have access to housing and to where the jobs are, then I do not believe that we can deal seriously with the question of integration or desegregated schools.
And here's a question. In your opinion, is the Department of Housing and Urban Development fulfilling its purpose of existence? Should its powers be expanded? Should they be reduced?
Well, because I think that question can probably be asked of any governmental agency, both at the state, local, and national level. As to its powers being expanded or reduced, I would settle for a full-time enforcement of those housing policies that are presently on the books, namely the 1968 Housing Act.
Here's one. What do you think of the plan of the American Institute of Architects to have the federal government buy up urban land for resale and development?
Well, I don't generally comment about things I don't know anything about. And I don't know exactly what this relates to. It's a new idea. What I would be concerned about, if this is a fact, is the process by which that is done, the extent to which blacks would be involved in it at the planning stages, at the implementation stages, and the extent to which they will be economically empowered to participate in the sale and repurchase and development of these lands.
This member asks, with the replacement of millions of farm laborers by machinery and similar mechanical facilities in offices and factories, what about the future of job opportunities?
Well, that, of course, is a question that transcends race. And it's a question that, all of us, whether we're black or white or brown or red, are definitively confronted with. And it seems to me that the various sectors, the public sector and the private sector, really have a responsibility to look at the question of the utilization of manpower as we become a more mechanized society. And I must say that I do not have the answer to that.
How effective is the so-called black silent majority?
Well, there's an implicit assumption in there that there is a black silent majority. What is very clear to me that there is a complacent white majority that just takes things as they come. I think that a silent majority or minority in this society is absolutely non-effective. You cannot be effective through silence. I think this is a nation where the government responds to the people, and it responds to crises, and it responds to what happens. The government did not initiate the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That law was written from Selma to Montgomery. The government, by its very nature, is a responding agency, but it only responds to that which it hears. Therefore, if you're silent, whether you're black, white, red, or brown, I think that you cannot be effective.
You may not feel qualified in a theological discussion, but here is a question that seems to be of interest. What is the significance of the movement of prominent blacks to the Muslim faith?
Well, seems to me that somebody's done a good job of conversion.
This questioner, perhaps the doctor, asks, are there any unique health problems that hurt the development of minorities?
Well, everybody thinks about sickle cell. It's something that everybody has discovered and is beaten on these days. But I think that if we look at the whole problem of health, that it goes far beyond sickle cell. It is probably one of the most basic problems in the society as relates not only to blacks, but as relates to the entire society, because all of the newly won civil rights, the newly won employment opportunities don't make much difference if your body is racked with pain and with sickness. The health is one of the biggest and most expensive enterprises in this country. And I think if an examination of the various comprehensive health plans in terms of their policy formulation and their implementation, I think shows a very tragic neglect and disregard for the importance of the involvement of black people in that decision making and in that implementation.
Mr. Jordan, this questioner asks, will our volunteer military forces, with their high pay rates, attract large numbers of black people?
Well, first of all, I'm opposed to a volunteer military force. I did it when I was on the President's Advisory Committee on the draft, and I do now. My notion is that given the prevailing attitude about war and dying in this country now, that I doubt that higher rates of pay will attract anybody, because I think that the whole question of war and devastation of people is now a big issue amongst poor people, amongst rich people, amongst middle-class people. And I doubt seriously that that pay will make any difference for blacks or for anybody else as they think about a career of military service.
And this member asks, why is it impossible for most agencies to recruit qualified black police?
That's an assumption that I'm not sure that's true. And I think that we have not really addressed ourselves to the process by which that recruitment takes place. Who does it, how it's done, the approach that is taken to it, I'm not sure. One other reason may well be that the experiences of blacks historically with police, that is being on the other end of the billy club, the beating end, may well have planted the notion in minds of many numbers of black people and other minorities that that is something that maybe they don't want to do. To some extent, I think that is unfortunate. I think that we have to have law enforcement. I think that we have to have sensible, sane police officers. And I would hope that local police departments would consult with agencies like the Urban League about how to recruit people and how to talk to people and how to give them the cell to do things that are terribly important to the general welfare of the society.
And here again, an organizational question. What does the National Urban Coalition stand for? Is it the same as the National Urban League?
I'll answer the last question first. It is not the same, and if you've been sending your checks to the coalition, you should have been sending them here. You send them to the Urban League. They are not the same. The National Urban Coalition, which of course was a result of the riots in the late 1960s, is a coalition of the private sector, business, private organizations, church groups, labor, blacks, Chicanos, and what have you. I think it stands for giving all minorities in this country a fair and equitable share of the rewards and the responsibilities of this society. Its approach and its efforts in this regard, I think, have been positive and have been good. I'm a national vice chairman of it, along with Andrew Heiskell and Jim Roach, of former chairman of General Motors. It is not the same as Urban League. It's young. It's still finding its way. We're 62 years old. We got a pretty good idea of where we're going and how we're going to get there.
Mr. Jordan, this member wants to know, what is the National Urban League doing to reduce the problem of drug abuse that permeates our urban society?
Well, we have just, on my first speech to the Urban League Conference as its new director last week, proposed that the Urban League and all of its 100 local affiliates across the country institute a program of preventive drug education amongst parents and children in the ghetto and the ghettos across this country. And our reason for doing this is that, black people have been nodding in the doorways for an awful long time. And King Heroin has been going into the arms of black youth and young adults for a very long time. But it was not until such time that white middle-class children in Westchester County, where I live, and in suburban communities across this country started using their allowances and their earnings for drugs, that drugs became public enemy number one. And now that drugs have become public enemy number one, we're going to take advantage of what we've learned as black people, and that's to piggyback the issue and take advantage of the new resources that all of a sudden are now being made available now that it's a problem for middle-class white kids.
Here's a question that will doubtless spark your response. Do you believe that bad housing for the minorities is a result rather than a cause of ghetto squalor?
Well, I think that addresses itself to the investment bankers, to the building trades, to the construction people, to some extent to FHA, which is now the largest landlord in this country, where people have been used and treated unfairly and put in bad housing by some sharpster real estate salesman. So I think that we first have to address ourselves to the quality of the kind of houses that's being built, and then address ourselves to the whole question of making those houses and that housing accessible to poor people and minority people on a fair and equitable basis.
Mr. Jordan, our time has expired. On behalf of the Commonwealth Club of California, I extend to you our sincere thanks for your enlightening address to us today and your direct response to the wide variety of questions you have received. We're most grateful. The meeting stands adjourned. Thank you, sir, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Good, very good.